All right, everyone, settle in. Tonight, we begin with one of the most intricate, disciplined, and majestic civilizations in world history, Imperial China. For over 2,000 years, it established benchmarks in science, philosophy, warfare, art, and bureaucracy. But don't romanticize it too quickly, because as breathtaking as the Forbidden City might appear from a distance, if you had lived there, your life would have been anything but glamorous. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. And please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always truly fascinating to see our audience connecting from all corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's smoothly transition into tonight's journey together. Welcome to Imperial China, where from the moment of your birth, society graciously assigns you a role and then permanently seals it. Imagine the social system as a multi-tiered cake, only you're the stale bottom layer, and the sweet frosting never reaches you. At the very pinnacle sits the emperor, also known as the Son of Heaven, a lovely title until you realize heaven doesn't entertain complaints. He rules by the mandate of heaven, meaning as long as crops flourish and rebellions remain subdued, his divine status stands unchallenged. Should things go awry, well, it seems heaven simply changed its mind. Time for a new dynasty. Below him are the scholar officials, men who dedicated most of their lives to memorizing Confucian texts, reciting philosophies no one requested, and developing stooped postures from a lifetime immersed in bamboo scrolls and a sense of social superiority. They successfully navigated the imperial exams, which were essentially the SATs where failure meant eternal poverty. Next come the farmers. Yes, the muddy, sun-scorched, often underfed backbone of society. Confucian doctrine actually held them in high regard. They sustained the empire, after all. Unfortunately, respect didn't extend to dental care or lunch breaks. Then arrived the artisans, the individuals who meticulously crafted objects with their hands. Paper, porcelain, fans, and frustration. Indispensable, absolutely. Respected, not so much. But at least they weren't merchants. Merchants, wealthier than most, trusted by none. According to Confucian values, profiting from others' labor was morally questionable. So you could be adorned in silk and silver yet still be treated like a tax-evading raccoon draped in brocade. Below them, we reach the societal foundation. Soldiers, servants, butchers, actors, and criminals. Essentially anyone you'd rather not sit beside at a formal banquet. Oh, and monks occupying a vague position between holy man and why are you bald and barefoot in public? And finally, women, not even represented on the pyramid itself. They were more like the surrounding gravel, born to obey their fathers, transferred to obey their husbands, and expected to produce sons who could someday obey even more men. So, if you were born in Imperial China with aspirations of pursuing your dreams, society had a single response. That's charming. Now, get back to work. Your day in Imperial China begins bright and early, not because you're naturally an early riser, but because the rooster's crow is deafening and the village bell clangs as if summoning the afterlife. You open your eyes, stretch, and then immediately recall that merely existing isn't an option. First, you bow, not to some abstract deity or noble ideal, but to your father, then your mother, then your grandfather, and possibly your great-aunt if she's still drawing breath. This is filial piety, and it's not merely encouraged. It's compulsory. Forgetting to bow isn't just rude. It's an invitation for cosmic shame to befall 7 generations of your lineage. And you don't just bow once, you bow in stages. You bow upon waking. You bow before eating. You bow if someone older than you so much as coughs in your direction. If you haven't bowed at least 6 times before breakfast, are you truly Chinese? Now, imagine you accidentally speak out of turn during morning tea. Perhaps you inquire, "Why must I wash uncle's feet?" Congratulations, you've just committed unfilial behavior, which ranks only slightly below public arson in terms of social disgrace. You'd best start practicing your apology, complete with 3 full kowtows and an optional forehead-to-floor touch. And yes, even the furniture silently judges you. Most households lacked chairs unless they were wealthy, so you'd be kneeling on woven mats, attempting to maintain composure while your elders delivered 45-minute monologues on respect, discipline, and how the world has deteriorated since the last dynasty. Let's not forget the Confucian hierarchy chart, the spiritual PowerPoint slide that dictates who speaks, sits, or even breathes first. Age supersedes youth, men outrank women, and fathers outrank everyone. Even among siblings, older ones hold conversational precedence. If you're the youngest, simply nod, smile, and hope you're not held responsible for someone else's misdeeds. There is no good morning in Imperial China. There is only a sequence of respectful rituals and a silent prayer that you won't accidentally offend someone and be disowned today. You've bowed approximately 47 times before 7 a.m. Congratulations, you've survived the day's opening ceremony. Now it's time for breakfast, the most crucial meal of the day, to remind you that life is indeed suffering. So what's on the menu? Let's see. A steaming bowl of rice gruel, also known as congee, which is a generous description for hot, wet nothing. It's made by boiling rice in water until the rice surrenders and becomes soup. If you're fortunate, it contains a hint of salt. If you're exceptionally lucky, a solitary sliver of pickled vegetable might drift by like a rare koi. If your family falls into the poorer demographic, and statistically that's likely you, that bowl of congee is about as thrilling as your social prospects. You consume it quietly, respectfully, under the silent scrutiny of at least one grandparent who recalls a time when even gruel was a luxury. Meat? Don't even consider it. That's reserved for festivals, weddings, and imperial officials who haven't set foot in a rice paddy since the Han Dynasty. Eggs are a possibility, but they are typically preserved in salt or ash until they resemble fossilized melancholy. If pork belly makes an appearance, you instantly check for visiting relatives or divine intervention. Tea is served, of course, not for leisure, but because plain water is suspicious. Tea, at least, has been boiled and is therefore statistically less likely to cause your demise. You sip it slowly, even as your stomach queries when the meal actually commenced. Meanwhile, you eat in silence. Meals are not for conversation. You don't discuss dreams, ambitions, or how you wept last night contemplating the imperial exam. You eat facing the ancestral shrine, silently grateful for your ancestors. Even if they bequeathed you a thatched roof, chronic anemia, and insurmountable family expectations. The bowls are coarse ceramic, the spoons crafted from wood. There are no napkins. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve if it's sufficiently clean, and prepare to begin working off the meal you barely consumed. As you rise, your father nods once. Eat quickly. Heaven favors the diligent, which roughly translates to get back to work. We have dynasties to uphold. You've finished your bowl of existential porridge, and now it's time to get dressed. Not to impress, but to avoid fines, floggings, or being mistaken for a social class above your station. Because in Imperial China, your attire isn't about self-expression. It's about survival. Let's start with the fabric hierarchy. Are you a farmer? Hemp. Coarse, itchy, scratchy hemp. The medieval equivalent of wearing a potato sack steeped in disappointment. Are you a noble? Silk. Glorious, shimmering silk that drapes like poetry and whispers. Tax the peasants more. And guess what? If you're caught wearing the wrong fabric, you're not just unfashionable. You're committing a crime. Clothing wasn't merely a matter of comfort. It was law. The government had meticulous regulations on sleeve width, hat shape, belt ornaments, and even color. Yellow, for instance, was reserved exclusively for the emperor. Wear yellow as a commoner, and you're not initiating a fashion trend. You're initiating your own execution. Let's discuss footwear. Cloth shoes for peasants. Exquisitely embroidered silk slippers for the elite. Practicality? Optional. Comfort? Unlikely. You didn't dress for the weather. You dressed for the dynasty. And now the feet. Specifically, foot binding. The aesthetic equivalent of transforming your toes into a curled-up secret. If you were a highborn girl, your feet were broken, folded under, and tightly bound from the age of 5. Why? Because tiny, deformed feet, known as lotus feet, were considered beautiful. A woman's worth was literally measured by how effectively she could hobble across a room without stumbling. It wasn't just painful, it was permanent. Foot binding crippled generations of women, turning walking into an act of art and agony. But don't worry, at least you got to wear embroidered shoes no one ever saw, because walking far wasn't really an option anymore. Even men didn't escape sartorial misery. Bureaucrats wore heavy, layered robes year-round, even in summer, because status consistently outranked sweat. Some outfits even featured winged hat flaps, designed to prevent officials from whispering to each other during court proceedings. So yes, Imperial Chinese fashion was elegant, symbolic, and profoundly political. But it also chafed, pinched, caused overheating, or outright shattered your bones. Beauty is pain, they say, but here pain was mandatory, and beauty was a government-approved dress code. You're now properly dressed in your socially acceptable potato fiber tunic. Excellent. Time to venture out and earn your daily calories, assuming the land, weather, and taxes permit it. Let's be frank, in Imperial China, work wasn't a calling. It was an interminable endurance test, conceptualized by Confucius and enforced by individuals who had likely never touched a shovel in their lives. If you're a farmer, and statistically you'll spend your entire life hunched over a rice paddy. Not in a poetic, cinematic way, no. This is literal, backbreaking labor. You wake before dawn, plant seedlings knee-deep in muck, swat away mosquitoes the size of small birds, and pray the landlord doesn't further increase your grain tax this year. Rain? You work. Drought? You work harder. Locusts? Work and simultaneously scream at the sky. The tools are rudimentary. A wooden plow if you're fortunate, your bare hands if you're not. Your ox is both your closest companion and your retirement plan. Lose him, and it's just you against 10 acres of disappointment. Now, let's say you're a woman. Your workload comes with a sequel. You'll assist in the fields, cook, clean, spin thread, weave fabric, raise children, and somehow still be held accountable when dinner is delayed or your husband sneezes incorrectly. Rest? That's something noble ladies do while discussing poetry. Artisans fare little better. You spend hours crafting pottery, paper, or tools by hand, then sell them for barely enough to purchase stale tofu. And merchants, technically wealthier but socially stigmatized, you could acquire half the village and still be treated as a walking moral failure. Then there's corvée labor, government-mandated service. One day, the emperor might require a new road, canal, or tomb. Guess who's helping build it for free with a smile and no shoes? You. Refuse, and you're branded a criminal or, worse, a rebel. And at the end of it all, you trudge home, covered in dirt, to a bowl of thin porridge and the quiet satisfaction of having survived another day. In Imperial China, work doesn't liberate you. It merely keeps you too exhausted to rebel. The imperial exam system, the grand pathway to social advancement, or, as it's more accurately known, China's perpetual written torture chamber. If you were a man born with a hint of ambition and a family slightly above destitution, your life's trajectory was clear. Pass the civil service exam. Succeed, and you would become an official, respected, powerful, adorned in silk robes and seated on actual chairs. Fail? Back to the rice fields, peasant. Simple? Not even close. These exams were less about multiple choice questions and more about memorizing the entire Confucian canon verbatim and composing poetic essays that would move a 1,000-year-old ghost to tears. Imagine being evaluated not just on grammar and meaning, but on whether your handwriting flowed like a morally upright river. One smudge, one character misplaced, one metaphor too audacious, instant failure. Studying commenced in early childhood and continued until your hairline receded. Boys crammed inside freezing study huts or endured sweltering summers, scribbling out essays until their fingers permanently curled into brush-holding claws. Tutors drilled doctrine into your mind like academic blacksmiths. Your social life? Non-existent. Your hobbies? Confucius. Your dreams? Still Confucius. The highest exam, the jinshi, was administered in the capital. You were confined to a cubicle the size of a coffin with only paper, ink, and soul-crushing anxiety. You brought your own food, blanket, and chamber pot. Some examinees fainted. Others went mad. A few died. Yes, literally died from the pressure, and they weren't even granted partial credit. Even if you passed the first round, more exams awaited. District, provincial, national. Years could pass. Decades. Some men took exams into their 60s. One individual reportedly attempted the exam over 40 times. That's not determination. That's trauma with a calligraphy pen. And if you failed, social shame. Your family, who had sacrificed everything for your education, would be disappointed, and vocally so. Your neighbors would whisper. Your mother might weep. Your father might give you the look, the one, "Why weren't you born smarter?" stare. So yes, the exam could elevate you to greatness or shatter your mind, your body, and your lineage, all for the chance to be overworked, underpaid, and micromanaged by palace eunuchs. Worth it? That's a question for Confucius. Feeling dirty yet? Don't worry, you will, because in Imperial China, personal hygiene wasn't so much a lifestyle as it was a seasonal suggestion. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. It happened occasionally, perhaps once every few weeks if you were lucky and not freezing to death. In summer, certainly, a dip in the river. In winter, you might go a month without a proper wash. And no, there was no lavender-scented soap. Soap, when used, was made from animal fat and ashes, a gritty mixture that felt like exfoliating with misery. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in larger cities, but privacy wasn't really a concept. You'd be scrubbing your armpits next to an elderly merchant and a shrieking toddler while a monk recited hygiene proverbs in the corner. Refreshing. Toothpaste? Try salt, charcoal, or powdered bones. Toothbrushes were fashioned from animal hair tied to bamboo. Effective only if your aim was to mildly dislodge your plaque into a new location. Dental hygiene wasn't exemplary, which likely explains why most older adults sported smiles akin to haunted jack-o'-lanterns. And then there were the parasites, lice, fleas, bedbugs. These were less. Pests, and more. Permanent residents. It didn't matter your wealth. If you had hair, you had company. Comb shops thrived because everyone required a lice comb, and if you didn't, you scratched your scalp as if attempting to summon lightning. Clothing offered no relief. You wore the same outfit for weeks. Washing clothes demanded hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing by hand, and hoping your shirt didn't disintegrate into fibers. Underwear existed but wasn't a daily necessity, especially for peasants, who often wore none at all, a rather risky endeavor. And don't dwell on the toilets, or rather do, for your own sake. A toilet was typically a hole in the ground, occasionally framed by wooden boards if you were opulent. Public latrines? Functional in the same way a haunted well is functional. Foul-smelling, crowded, and perpetually one step away from a biological catastrophe. Imperial China boasted silk, philosophy, poetry, and palaces, but if you craved a long, hot, private shower, you were approximately 1,500 years too early. So you've survived the lice, the breakfast disappointment, and the soul-crushing exam preparation. But before you even consider complaining to your neighbor, remember, in Imperial China, the law is perpetually vigilant, and unlike modern surveillance, this one comes equipped with bamboo sticks and highly inventive punishments. Let's begin with the legal code. Imperial dynasties, particularly during the Tang and Qing periods, were renowned for their exhaustively detailed laws. There were regulations concerning taxes, hairstyles, hat shapes, appropriate mourning etiquette, and even the permissible duration of grieving for your in-laws. Accidentally wearing the wrong color on the wrong festival day? Technically criminal. And yes, they kept meticulous records. Official bamboo strip documents, inked and filed by overworked scribes who likely loathed their profession. Punishment was anything but subtle. Forget modern courtrooms and community service. Imperial justice embraced education through suffering. For minor offenses, you might be flogged with a bamboo rod. Fun fact, the court even employed different sizes of sticks, depending on the crime. A light insult? Small stick. Stole a chicken? Bigger stick. Failed to bow deeply enough to a magistrate's horse? Expect a surprise stick combination. For more serious crimes, things escalated rapidly. You could be branded, tattooed on the face with your crime, sent into exile, or, if you truly offended someone important, publicly executed slowly. Torture wasn't an exception. It was standard procedure. If accused of something, the court would often assist your confession with thumbscrews, forced kneeling on spiked boards, or prolonged hours in a stressed position while being shouted at by a humorless man with a scroll. And here's the best part. You didn't even need to be guilty, just suspicious, inconvenient, or politically unfortunate. Even your family could be held accountable. The law favored collective punishment. If your cousin uttered something seditious during a rice wine binge, you might awaken to find your house under investigation, because guilt apparently was hereditary. The law was structured. It was advanced. It was terrifying. Justice in Imperial China was less about fairness and more about obedience. The message was clear. Behave, respect the established order, and whatever you do, avoid eye contact with the magistrate's concubine. Welcome to the imperial justice system's preferred pastime, torture. Not as a punishment, but as a convenient pretrial icebreaker. Let's say someone accuses you of stealing a chicken, disrespecting your father, or, heaven forbid, expressing a controversial opinion about the emperor's poetry. The magistrate doesn't begin by asking for your side of the story. No. This is Imperial China. You start by being tied to a bench while they bring out the confession toolkit. First up, the bamboo rod, used for beating your back, buttocks, or thighs until you regret crimes you may not even comprehend. This wasn't random violence. They maintained official punishment logs, counting every stroke with bureaucratic precision. 30 lashes for theft, 45 for lying, and 1 bonus lash for squirming. Still denying guilt? Time for an upgrade. Kneeling on spiked boards was a classic. You kneel on rough wood embedded with stones or glass until your legs give out or your will breaks. It's a bit like yoga if yoga were conceived by irate civil servants. Then there's the finger crusher. 2 slabs of wood tightened with rope around your fingers. Fun fact, it was called the small tiger bench, which sounds charming until your bones snap like kindling. It's challenging to write a confession with broken fingers, but they weren't concerned with penmanship. And yes, this was standard procedure. Torture wasn't considered morally questionable. It was simply the most efficient method to extract the truth, or at least a version of it that aligned with the official narrative. If you still refused to confess, they would simply escalate. Some punishments involved being stretched, whipped, or left tied up in the summer sun while officials took a lunch break. And don't bother screaming. The neighbors are accustomed to it. Now imagine you're innocent. Congratulations. You still get tortured because a clear confession was necessary for proper record keeping. Better to admit to something than risk being labeled uncooperative. Imperial logic at its finest. So next time you lament modern bureaucracy, remember, at least the DMV doesn't beat you with bamboo until you confess to potentially improper parking in 1372. You may believe you're alone, but in Imperial China, someone is always watching. And no, it's not just your judgmental grandmother. The surveillance state wasn't digital. It was human, meticulously trained, state-sanctioned, and terrifyingly thorough. It began at the village level, where every town had a local baojia, or village elder, who wasn't just there to distribute rice. He was also your friendly neighborhood informant. Your neighbors? Also spies. Your extended family? Absolutely spies. Your servant who claims to be illiterate and deaf? Definitely a spy. People were incentivized to report suspicious behavior, and suspicious could encompass anything from hoarding too much grain to coughing during a tribute speech. Even maintaining excessive quiet could raise eyebrows. What are you concealing, citizen? In the cities, a sophisticated network of yamen runners, scribes, and magistrate assistants were employed, whose duty was to investigate crimes, deliver messages, and subtly observe your every action. Every dynasty possessed its own iteration of this apparatus, but the objective remained consistent: preserve peace by peering through every available crevice. Especially fond of surveillance were the eunuchs in the imperial palace, those castrated palace servants who could not father children, but were certainly capable of instigating coups. Many controlled their own secret police forces, operated spy rings, and whispered in the ears of emperors. Some eunuchs wielded more power than ministers, simply by knowing who said what to whom and when. And don't even attempt to criticize the system. Lambasting the emperor even indirectly, like remarking, "The sun appears a little weary today," could be construed as slander. Poets learned to master the art of subtlety. Everyone else simply mastered the art of silence. What's more, the government frequently published lists of executed criminals as a warning, complete with names and crimes. It was akin to an ancient Facebook feed, but with more beheadings. So if you harbored a rebellious thought, you kept it to yourself. If you had a rebellious cousin, you turned him in. And if someone smiled too broadly while inquiring about your political opinions, that was your cue to feign a cough and flee. Because in Imperial China, the walls had ears, and so did the trees, the neighbors, and likely your rice bowl. In Imperial China, marriage was not about finding love under cherry blossoms. It was about duty, negotiation, and dowries so substantial they could snap your ox cart's axle. Love, that was for poems, not for people. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Marriages were always arranged. Parents determined your destiny while you were still learning to hold chopsticks. If your family possessed status, they would engage a matchmaker, a professional investigator who compared horoscopes, family records, and whether your future spouse's ancestors had committed any embarrassing acts 5 dynasties ago. If all criteria aligned, congratulations. You were engaged to someone you had likely never met. Physical attraction, personality, shared interests, irrelevant. Compatibility was measured in birth charts and tax records. For women, marriage wasn't an exciting new chapter. It was a polite kidnapping adorned with ceremonial robes. You permanently left your family, adopted your husband's surname, and moved into his home, where you were now expected to serve not only him, but his parents, his grandparents, and any cantankerous uncle residing in the guest room. The dowry system meant your family had to provide money, goods, or land with you. More was always better. Consider it ancient China's version of, "Thanks for taking her off our hands." In return, the groom's family might offer betrothal gifts, but don't get overly excited. Sometimes that meant silks and jewelry, other times a slightly better chicken. Once married, your role was clear. Produce male heirs, obey your in-laws, and never, ever talk back. A wife was expected to be modest, silent, and industrious, the sacred trinity of Confucian womanhood. If you were too vocal, too opinionated, or, heaven forbid, infertile, you might legally be replaced with a concubine. Speaking of which, yes, concubinage was practiced. Men could take multiple concubines, especially if wealthy. Women, one man, one chance at survival. Divorce, rare, and social suicide. The only acceptable grounds were 7 outs, including jealousy, disease, or excessive gossip. So if your tea-drinking habits sufficiently annoyed your husband, he could legally discard you. Pleasant. In short, marriage in Imperial China was less happily ever after and more. Try not to get exiled for serving cold noodles. So you're contemplating rebellion? Perhaps you're weary of backbreaking labor, endless bowing, or that conceited magistrate who taxed your rice and your dignity in the same afternoon. Bold move. Unfortunately, in Imperial China, rebellion didn't transform you into a hero. It made you a very fleeting headline. Let's start with the fantasy. You gather a motley band of peasants, burn your landlord's tax ledgers, and declare a glorious new era of justice. The problem? The Imperial Army arrives 3 days later with horses, crossbows, and no sense of humor. You see, the emperors weren't just bureaucrats in golden hats. They were obsessed with stability. Confucian ideology asserted that rebellion signified disorder, and disorder meant the universe was out of balance. That made you not just a criminal, but a cosmic threat. And the punishment for cosmic threats? Dramatic. You'd be captured, paraded, tortured, and often executed in a manner specifically designed to deter creative thinking. Public beheadings were common, as was quartering. One emperor preferred slow slicing, a charming method where you were repeatedly cut until your administrative paperwork and your torso were complete. And it didn't stop with you. The imperial government adored collective punishment. Your family, your neighbors, even that one individual who once lent you a hoe, they were all fair game. The logic was simple. If we eradicate your entire village, no one will rebel again. Effective, terrifying. Still, rebellions did occur. From the Yellow Turban Rebellion to the White Lotus Uprising, desperate people occasionally rose up, and while some ignited chaos, most were brutally suppressed. The survivors were either enslaved, silenced, or conscripted into public works projects they wouldn't survive long enough to complete. Even discussing rebellion was perilous. Writing a defiant poem that hinted at discontent? Bang. Arrested. Forced to confess under bamboo interrogation. If you're fortunate, you're exiled to the outer provinces to reflect on your actions somewhere cold, rocky, and strategically flea-infested. So yes, rebellion sounded romantic, the stuff of dramas and legends, but in reality, you were more likely to become a cautionary tale etched onto a public plaque. Want to change the system? Best to literally keep your head down. So perhaps you thought, if I can't succeed as a peasant, maybe I'll ascend through the ranks, ace the exams, and enjoy a comfortable life as a government official. Charming. Welcome to court life in Imperial China, where yes, the tea is hot, the robes are silk, and the palace floors gleam with a divine polish. But so do the knives concealed behind everyone's backs. Let's begin with the Forbidden City, the emperor's heavily guarded marvel. Inside, everyone is smiling and scheming. Eunuchs, ministers, concubines, scholar officials, all locked in a constant game of courteous treachery. The only thing more ruthless than court life was actual throat-cutting, which also occurred frequently. If you were an official, your every movement was observed, not just by spies, but by rivals awaiting your misstep. Filing a report with the wrong character? Treason. Mispronouncing the emperor's name during a reading? Treason. Hesitating before kneeling? Treason adjacent at the very least. And let's discuss eunuchs. Castrated palace servants who wielded disproportionate power. Many began humbly, rose swiftly, and became gatekeepers to the emperor's inner world. Angering a eunuch? You might find your promotion mysteriously delayed or your name added to a secret list of accidental disappearances. Meanwhile, the imperial harem was not a romantic fantasy. It was a high-stakes political battleground. Concubines competed for favor, sabotaged rivals, and hoped to bear a prince, preferably one who wasn't poisoned before the age of 5. The empress might technically be in charge, but good luck controlling 30 jealous women with nothing to do but creatively plot. Even poetry was risky. Compose the wrong metaphor about wilting flowers or a crumbling wall, and someone might interpret it as criticism of the emperor. There were officials executed for writing poems about the weather because the emperor understood the subtle implications. And when the emperor died, then the real excitement began. Succession disputes, secret wills, mysterious deaths, unfortunate illnesses. Half the court typically didn't survive the transition. So no, court life wasn't safer. It was simply death in a silk wrapper. Your robe might be red, but so was the floor beneath it. You've made it this far, bowed, endured pain, memorized 400 Confucian sayings, and evaded at least 3 forms of death. But here's the profound truth about life in Imperial China. You were a statistic, a head count, a line item on a dusty tax ledger. To the empire, you were not a person with hopes and dreams. You were a grain of rice, small, anonymous, easily crushed, and ideally harvested for labor or revenue. The state cared not for your ambition, talent, or inner beauty. It cared whether your family paid its taxes promptly and produced able-bodied sons for conscription into the next border defense project. From the emperor's perspective, you were one speck among hundreds of millions, and not even a glamorous speck. You weren't the golden imperial seal or a sacred relic. You were a moving component in a rice-producing, silk-spinning, canal-digging machine built to sustain dynastic continuity. Your birth was recorded not for celebration, but for future tax extraction. Your death was noted primarily so your family wouldn't continue claiming your rations. And in between, your life's purpose was to avoid causing problems, adhere to protocol, fulfill your role, and try not to starve during a drought. Individualism, a quaint notion, it didn't exist. You didn't pursue your passion. You followed your father, your master, or your assigned bureaucratic rank. The concept of being unique, of standing out, was as threatening to the state as a crop blight or a Mongol invasion. Harmony was paramount. Even your emotions were expected to align with your social status. Feeling sad as a peasant? Acceptable. Feeling inspired? Sit down. The census didn't inquire about your favorite poem. It asked if your roof leaked and whether you owned a pig. Even your body belonged to the system. Drafted for public works, you might be sent to construct a canal you'd never benefit from or guard a wall you'd never see completed. Die along the way? No issue. There were always more grains where you originated. In Imperial China, you mattered, but only as long as you could be counted, taxed, or quietly buried. So here we are, many sections deep, and if you've been attentive, one truth is evident. Imperial China was magnificent and magnificently merciless. Yes, this civilization bestowed upon the world some of its most profound inventions. Gunpowder, paper, the compass, printing, and a bureaucracy that actually functioned, mostly. The Great Wall meandered across mountains. The Forbidden City stood as a testament to imperial will. And poetry flowed like the Yellow River. Beautiful, endless, and often fatal if misinterpreted. Its legacy, unmatched. The reality, backbreaking, hierarchical, and constantly one poor rice harvest away from collapse. For every elegant brushstroke recorded in a scholar's diary, there were 10,000 peasants ankle-deep in mud, questioning whether this year's tax grain would leave anything to eat. For every emperor interred beneath a mountain of jade and gold, there were hundreds of laborers buried beneath the same mountain because they were inconvenient witnesses. The brilliance of Imperial China did not come cheaply. It was paid for in childhoods lost to exam study, backs broken from fieldwork, and lives curtailed by law, famine, or conscription. The system operated splendidly for the privileged few. For everyone else, it worked them until they broke. And the most tragic aspect? Most of them accepted it, not because they embraced oppression, but because the system had convinced them it was the natural order of things, that heaven had appointed their emperor, that filial piety, obedience, and silence were virtues, that suffering quietly was a form of virtue. That legacy, the duality of splendor and suffering, still resonates today. When people reflect on Imperial China, they often envision the calligraphy, the architecture, the philosophical quotes etched in stone. They don't always see the concubine poisoned in the harem, the starving mother selling her comb for rice, or the scholar who failed the exam for the 7th time and simply vanished. So no, you wouldn't have lasted a day in Imperial China, not because you're weak, but because that world wasn't designed for survival. It was built for endurance, tradition, and control. And yet, through it all, the empire endured. The people endured. But only a select few of their stories were ever truly told. In the spring of 1846, the vast westward migration was in full swing. The Oregon Trail hummed with activity. Oxen plodding, wagon wheels creaking, and families dreaming of fresh starts. Among these travelers was a group of approximately 30 individuals led by brothers George and Jacob Donner and businessman James F. Reed. They weren't seeking fortunes or adventures. They were farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and children pursuing the promise of California's fertile valleys. Their timing seemed perfect. Snows wouldn't fall for months, and the well-worn western path had already seen thousands pass before them. But the Donner Party, eventually numbering 87 people, made one critical error that would set them on a tragic course. They chose a shortcut. This so-called shortcut was the Hastings Cutoff, an untested route promoted by Lansford Hastings, an opportunist who had never even traversed it himself with a wagon. It promised to shave weeks off the journey by cutting through Utah's Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had sent guides ahead to leave letters encouraging immigrants to take his new route. The Donner Party, trusting those letters, departed the traditional trail and followed his suggestion. At first, spirits remained high. The group included children, elderly parents, and entire families who sang hymns at night and clung to hope. But trouble quickly arose. The Wasatch Mountains proved far more treacherous than Hastings claimed. The wagons had to be disassembled, hauled piece by piece, and reassembled. Progress slowed to a crawl. Tempers flared. Supplies dwindled. Then came the desert. The Great Salt Lake Desert was a brutal, shimmering inferno. Hastings had stated it would take 2 days to cross. It took 5. Water barrels ran dry. Animals collapsed. Oxen went mad. Entire wagons were abandoned in the alkaline dust. They had already lost precious time, and winter was no longer a distant threat. By the time they rejoined the main trail, they had lost weeks. Other wagon trains had already crossed the Sierra Nevada. The Donner Party, exhausted and behind schedule, pressed onward, unaware that the most harrowing part of their journey still lay ahead. The dream of California persisted in their minds, but the mountains cared little for dreams, and soon, starvation would make them care little either. By late October 1846, the Donner Party finally reached the eastern base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was supposed to be the final major obstacle before descending into California's promised lands. But the mountains were not just tall. They were unforgiving, and winter was arriving early. The party was now fragmented. Some families had pushed ahead, while others, including the Donners and the Reeds, lagged behind, slowed by broken wagons, injured oxen, and sheer exhaustion. Snow began to fall, lightly at first, then relentlessly. Within days, the passes became impassable. They were trapped. They encamped at Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, and others stopped further back at Alder Creek. Makeshift cabins were constructed from pine logs and wagon parts. They butchered their remaining animals. Hides were fashioned into crude tents. The snow continued to fall over 6 feet, then 10. Hunger quickly set in. Rations were reduced. The livestock was gone. They boiled strips of rawhide and gnawed on leather belts. One child attempted to eat a blanket. Another chewed on a piece of bark until their gums bled. Every morning brought another cold body. Death progressed slowly, politely, then mercilessly. Inside those cabins, there was no warmth, only smoke, hunger, and silence. Mothers tried to comfort starving children. Fathers gazed out at the endless snow, calculating how far they might travel on foot. Arguments erupted. Hope dwindled like the thin mountain air. On November 12th, a blizzard sealed their fate. Snow piled up to the roofs. Trees snapped under the weight. Any thought of escape was buried under white silence. The pass was closed, and the California dream was gone, replaced by a desperate, singular objective: survival. By mid-December, with no rescue in sight, 15 of the strongest members formed what would be called the Forlorn Hope Party. 10 men and 5 women strapped crude snowshoes to their feet and attempted to traverse the mountains on foot, carrying meager rations and the unbearable burden of what might come next. Behind them, dozens remained at camp, starving, dying, and waiting in a frozen purgatory. And for the Forlorn Hope, the question wasn't if they would survive. It was who would perish first and who would consume them. On December 16, 1846, 15 desperate souls stepped into the snow and vanished into history. They were dubbed the Forlorn Hope not by newspapers, but by their fellow immigrants who watched them depart, fully understanding the meaning of forlorn, lost, hopeless, doomed. Each member carried only what they could: scraps of dried oxhide, flint, a rifle, and tattered blankets. They fashioned crude snowshoes, hoping to stay atop the deep drifts, but it barely worked. The snow was powdery and endless. They trudged for miles each day, slowed by exhaustion and the icy grip of high-altitude wilderness. Within days, they were lost. The food supply was depleted almost immediately. They had miscalculated the distance. A squirrel was caught, pine cone was boiled, and then a man collapsed. Franklin Graves, the oldest in the group. His daughters wept as he died in the snow. There was nothing they could do. And then, one by one, others began to fall. Antonio, the Mexican teamster, Patrick Dolan, raving and delirious, Lemuel Murphy, just 13. Death arrived not as a storm, but as a slow silence. It was quiet, white, inescapable. Then came the moment. The line crossed in desperation and cold logic. The survivors carved meat from their deceased companions. They wept, prayed, vomited, and ate again. It wasn't savagery. It was grim calculus. Starve or live. Sarah Graves, only 19, later recalled the initial taste. She never spoke of it again. William Foster, gaunt and silent, kept his thoughts to himself. Mary and Graves held her sister's hand and whispered that it didn't matter what they had to do, so long as they got home. By the time they stumbled out of the mountains weeks later, only 7 had survived, 5 women and 2 men. Their eyes were sunken, their cheeks frostbitten, their mouths silent. But they brought something far more potent than supplies or maps. They brought news. Dozens were still alive, trapped at Donner Lake, starving, freezing, waiting, and they desperately needed help. Now, California, which had largely ignored the Donner crisis, suddenly awakened. The horror was too immense, the shame too pervasive. Rescue parties were organized, but by the time they arrived, the snow had grown even deeper, and in the cabins by the lake, what they discovered was beyond comprehension. The first rescue party reached Donner Lake in February 1847, 2 months after the forlorn hope emerged from the mountains. What they found wasn't a mere camp. It was a graveyard. Cabins were half buried in snow, their doors frozen shut. Inside, people sat motionless, too weak to stand, their eyes glazed over from starvation. Frozen bodies were stacked like firewood, and the pervasive, sickening, unforgettable odor spoke volumes about what had transpired when the meat ran out. Some attempted to speak, others simply stared. Of the 87 who had begun the journey, nearly half were dead, and those still breathing were barely human anymore. Emaciated, skeletal figures wrapped in filthy hides, whispering prayers to an indifferent sky. The rescuers had brought supplies: flour, dried meat, blankets, but not enough to save everyone. There was no way to transport dozens through snow drifts taller than wagons. They had to make agonizing decisions. Children were chosen first, the smallest, the lightest, those with the highest chance of surviving the arduous trek back down the mountains. Parents remained behind, watching silently as strangers carried away their children, uncertain if they would ever see them again. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue missions followed. Each battled whiteouts, avalanches, and terrain that had completely swallowed the Donner Party. With every return trip, the rescuers brought fewer supplies and found fewer survivors, along with darker stories. The truth began to emerge, not just of starvation, but of cannibalism, of how, in the direst nights, when all seemed lost, some survivors had consumed the dead. Some even whispered that others had killed to sustain themselves. Names were kept quiet, but the rumors were louder than the facts. Some were judged, others were pitted. Most were simply too traumatized to speak. James Reed, who had been banished early in the journey for killing a man in self-defense, returned as a rescuer. Against all odds, he found his wife and children still alive. George Donner, however, lay dying at Alder Creek, his arm gangrenous. His wife, Tamsin, refused to leave him. She remained behind when the others departed and never made it out. When the final survivors reached California in April 1847, the ordeal was over, but the scars, emotional, cultural, and historical, were just beginning to form. News of the Donner Party's ordeal spread east like wildfire, distorting with each retelling, growing darker, more grotesque. Newspapers couldn't get enough. America, gripped by manifest destiny fever, was suddenly confronting its darker side. The story was too compelling. Pioneers seeking paradise transformed into cannibals in the snow. Some headlines branded it the cannibal horror of the Sierra. Others accused survivors of murder. It wasn't just scandal, it was a national reckoning. The westward expansion had always been portrayed as glorious, divinely ordained, and inevitable. But now it was tainted by the image of starving settlers roasting human flesh over pinewood fires. Journalists fixated on every gruesome detail: who ate whom, who died nobly, and who took too long to perish. Sarah Graves, one of the survivors, was hounded for interviews. So was Mary Murphy, who lost almost her entire family. Survivors were caught between fame and shame, lauded for surviving, yet condemned for their methods. James Reed, once a disgraced exile, returned to San Jose a changed man, haunted but vindicated. His leadership during the rescue missions earned him public sympathy, and he dedicated much of his later life to protecting the reputations of the survivors. But even he couldn't silence the murmurs. Tamsin Donner became a tragic emblem, a devoted wife who remained with her dying husband, refusing rescue multiple times. When she finally attempted to leave with a group of men, she never made it. Her fate remains murky. Some said she died of cold. Others suggested she had been killed and eaten by the very men she trusted. The government, for its part, said little. California was on the verge of becoming U.S. territory, and the last thing officials desired was to tarnish the dream of westward expansion. The incident was dismissed as an unfortunate tragedy, an anomaly, no inquiry, no formal investigation. And yet, in every parlor and saloon, people discussed the Donners. The name itself became a cautionary tale. Children were warned, don't take shortcuts, don't stray from the trail, or you might end up like them. But beneath the horror, something more complex lingered. Questions about survival, morality, and just how thin the veneer of civilization truly is when the snow relentlessly falls. For those who lived through the Sierra Nightmare, the journey didn't conclude when the snow melted. Survival came at a cost, etched into bone and memory. The survivors emerged from the mountains, but they never truly left them behind. Many were children. They returned to civilization as walking ghosts, quiet, underfed, wide-eyed. Some, like Virginia Reed, just 13 at the time, would go on to live long lives. She eventually married, had children, and even published letters recounting her ordeal. But beneath her composed exterior lay trauma that pulsed like an old wound. Others fared worse. Mary Murphy, after losing her entire family, married young and died within a few years. Louis Keseberg, a German immigrant who had been among the last rescued, was forever branded by rumors that he had not only consumed the dead, but murdered them to do so. He sued a newspaper for libel and won $1 in damages. It didn't matter. The stain never left him. Some survivors attempted to disappear. They changed their names, moved far from California, or refused to speak about what had happened. Others couldn't stop talking, haunted not just by what they'd done, but by what they'd witnessed others do. It wasn't solely the cannibalism. It was the slow disintegration of humanity, observing friends wither into skeletons, hearing the silent weeping of mothers who could no longer feed their children, choosing who to save when rescue arrived because there was never room for all. Communities also reacted differently. Some treated the survivors with pity and respect, acknowledging their suffering as heroic endurance. Others whispered and gossiped, eager to distance themselves from what had become a living nightmare etched into the American frontier myth. James Reed, to his credit, rebuilt his reputation. He served in the Mexican-American War, prospered in San Jose, and lived to an old age. But even he admitted in letters that the images of the dead, the sounds of the camp, stayed with him always. No one who survived the Donner Party returned unchanged. Whether they were 8 or 80, they had stared into the abyss of desperation and made choices most people pray they'll never face. And in that silence between hunger and horror, they left behind a truth few wanted to admit. Survival is not always clean. It is not always noble. Sometimes it simply means living with what you had to become. The Sierra Nevada never forgot the Donners. The lake where many of them waited out the blizzards, where they died, starved, and consumed, is now known as Donner Lake, a picturesque natural beauty spot with a name that resonates with unease. Over time, the landscape became intertwined with the legend. Tourists came to see the site where the cabins once stood, to walk the snowy trails where the forlorn hope had trudged, to gaze at the mountains that had refused to allow the pioneers to pass. Locals recounted stories. Some whispered that the place was cursed, that the trees still remembered, that the winds carried voices. In 1918, a granite monument was erected near the lake. Atop it stands a solemn pioneer family, father, mother, and child, facing westward, eternally hopeful. The pedestal beneath them is 22 feet tall, marking the height of the snow that winter. It's a monument to endurance, to tragedy, to the fragile boundary between civilization and survival. But even in stone, the story remains unsettling. The monument makes no mention of cannibalism, no hint of the quiet desperation, the betrayals, or the dead who were consumed to keep others alive. It's a sanitized memory, designed for public comfort, not historical truth. Every year schoolchildren visit the site. They hear the basic version: pioneers trapped, survived, perhaps a mention of starvation, rarely the rest. It's simpler to honor grit than to confront the true cost of survival. Still, the mountains remember. The paths they took are still there, concealed beneath ski resorts and hiking trails. The spot where Tamsin Donner remained with her dying husband is now a picnic area. The frozen cabin where children wept in silence is replaced by interpretive plaques. And yet, the air feels heavy, as if the ground still holds the memory of boots crunching over snow, of mothers cradling dead infants, of strangers sharing meat with trembling hands and averted eyes. Nature offers no apologies. It simply exists. But the story persists, not just because it's horrifying, but because it's profoundly human. The Donner Party wasn't solely about failure or cannibalism. It was about the lengths people will go to protect their families, to cling to hope, to choose life even in its most dreadful form. And in the silence of the mountains, that choice still echoes. In the decades that followed, the story of the Donner Party evolved, distorted by memory, warped by gossip, and reshaped by a nation's appetite for drama. The facts were gruesome enough, but that didn't deter storytellers from making them worse, or, in some cases, more heroic. Some survivors were romanticized, portrayed as tragic pioneers who had faced hell and returned with scars. Others, like Louis Keseberg, became villains in the public imagination. He was accused of hoarding food, of murdering Tamsin Donner, of relishing what he had to do to survive. None of these accusations were proven, but truth in the era of printing presses and dime novels was never the priority. The public craved extremes. They desired not nuance, but either martyrs or monsters. This made life after survival difficult. Every interview, every newspaper sketch, every fictional retelling reopened wounds. Some survivors attempted to set the record straight. Virginia Reed, years later, published her own account. She implored future pioneers to avoid shortcuts and heed experienced advice. Others remained silent, worn down by the weight of their memories and the world's fascination with them. By the late 19th century, the Donner Party had become folklore. Campfire stories whispered in hushed tones, a cautionary tale taught to schoolchildren, a metaphor for poor planning, for hubris, for the consequences of trusting flawed advice. The Hastings cutoff became infamous, synonymous with fatal shortcuts. And over time, the true horror of the story, the cannibalism, was used to mask the deeper tragedy. That the entire ordeal could have been prevented, that poor leadership, arrogant promises, and systemic inexperience claimed more lives than snow ever did. Yet there's something uniquely American in how the tale persisted. It's not just a story of failure. It's a story of obsession with movement, with reinvention, with the fantasy of conquering nature and destiny. The Donner Party served as a mirror, reflecting not just desperation, but the myth of westward perfection cracking under its own weight. The truth is there were no heroes, no villains, just humans making impossible choices. And while the snow melted and time marched forward, the question never truly faded. What would you have done? Today, the Donner Party stands as more than a mere footnote in American history. It's a symbol, distorted, debated, and profoundly unsettling. Unlike other tales of pioneering grit, this one refuses to fit neatly into the narrative of noble westward expansion. It's a story that still provokes. We remember the cannibalism, yes, but that was only the final act. The real legacy lies in everything that led to it. The allure of shortcuts, the fatal impact of poor leadership, the faith placed in maps drawn by dreamers instead of realists. The Donner Party exposed the fragility of the American dream when confronted by the harsh indifference of nature. And yet, in that collapse, we also discover something else: endurance. The survivors didn't just descend from the mountains. They rebuilt their lives, married, had children. Some remained in California, others moved away to escape the whispers. A few even achieved quiet prosperity. Their lives weren't defined by what they had done to survive, but by the choice to continue living afterward. But the cost of that survival is enduring. The site at Donner Lake still stands, preserved and somber. Visitors walk through pine trees and melting snow, reading plaques about hunger and courage. Tour guides speak in hushed tones. Historians debate the details. Writers still cannot leave the story alone, because the Donner Party poses questions that history typically avoids. What happens when every remaining option is one you swore you'd never choose? What happens when the dream of paradise transforms into a snowy tomb? And if survival is all that remains, does it still matter how you achieve it? There are no satisfying answers, just echoes and bones buried beneath the snow. In the end, the Donner Party reminds us that human strength is measured not in glory, but in resolve. Not in conquest, but in the brutal, terrible choice to keep breathing, even when every comfort, law, and illusion of civilization has been stripped away. So we remember them, not just for what they did, but for what they endured. Not as legends or cautionary tales, but as people terrified, determined, flawed, and human. And in the Sierra winds, their story still whispers through the trees, forever frozen in time, forever unfinished. Wu Zetian was not born into royalty. She was born into something far more dangerous. Ambition cloaked in silk. The year was 624 CE, and the Tang Dynasty was still nascent, gleaming with promise and poetry. Her father was a timber merchant, sufficiently wealthy to provide his daughters with rare privileges. Tutors, books, and the revolutionary notion that a girl's intellect could be as sharp as any boy's sword. From an early age, Wu distinguished herself. While her peers learned embroidery and the art of humble tea pouring, Wu immersed herself in politics, history, and literature. She was captivated by strategy and narratives of imperial rule. She didn't merely read about powerful men. She envisioned herself among them. By the time she reached 14, her beauty, wit, and education attracted the attention of Emperor Taizong himself. She was summoned to the imperial palace and became one of the emperor's many concubines. At first glance, it might have seemed like a dead end. After all, she held a relatively low rank, a mere talented lady among dozens. But Wu had no intention of fading into obscurity. Even in a palace overflowing with silks and whispers, she stood out. She memorized the emperor's routines, his preferences, his moods. She mastered the art of silence, of knowing when to speak and when to discreetly withdraw. But most importantly, she observed. She watched how power was wielded and, more critically, how it was lost. And when Emperor Taizong fell ill, Wu did not panic. She planned. Upon his death, she should have been sent to a Buddhist convent, her life effectively over. But fate, or more accurately, Wu's astuteness, had other designs. She had already caught the eye of the emperor's son, Li Ji, the future Emperor Gaozong, and he hadn't forgotten her. What followed was the first in a long series of quiet revolutions. Wu was no longer just a concubine. She was a student of power, and soon she would become its master. The girl once concealed behind a palace screen would become the woman who ruled from the dragon throne. But her ascent had only just begun, and the empire was unprepared for what was coming. When Emperor Taizong died in 649 CE, palace protocol dictated Wu's next step with chilling clarity. She was to be sent to a convent and spend her remaining days, shaved-headed and silent. Most former concubines accepted this fate with quiet resignation. Wu Zetian, however, was not. Most. Before Taizong's death, she had already initiated a subtle and perilous entanglement with his son, Li Ji, the new Emperor Gaozong. Whether it was genuine affection or ruthless calculation, their bond endured the transition of power. And so, barely a year after entering the convent, Wu returned, not as a discarded widow, but as the emperor's secret consort. Empress Wang, Gaozong's wife, had ironically orchestrated Wu's return, hoping to divert the emperor's attention from another rival concubine. She invited Wu back into the palace. She might as well have handed her the keys to the empire. Wu played her new role with chilling grace. She bore the emperor's sons, an advantage no rival could match. But she didn't just provide him with heirs. she offered him ideas. It wasn't long before she became his closest advisor, whispering thoughts that slowly reshaped the mechanisms of state policy and court etiquette. Some claimed the emperor was in love. Others murmured he was bewitched. Either way, she was now indispensable. Then came the bloodshed. The rivalry with Empress Wang and another favored concubine, Consort Xiao, escalated into quiet warfare. In 654 CE, tragedy struck or was orchestrated. Wu's infant daughter died under suspicious circumstances. She accused Empress Wang of murder. What followed was swift and brutal. Wang and Xiao were deposed, imprisoned, and eventually mutilated. Empress Wang's limbs were severed and her tongue removed. Her final cries, it was said, resembled those of a pig being slaughtered. Wu Zetian was now empress. Officially, this wasn't merely a rise. It was a coup disguised as destiny. Wu had transitioned from concubine to empress, not with armies, but with alliances, calculated eliminations, and the steady erosion of her enemy's influence. She didn't just survive palace life. She bent it to her will. But she wasn't finished, not even close. She had tasted power. Now she desired the throne itself, not alongside the emperor, but above him. And for the first time in China's long and patriarchal history, that unthinkable dream would begin to materialize. By the late 660s, Empress Wu was no longer simply a consort who offered advice from behind a screen. She had become the empire's silent puppeteer. Emperor Gaozong's health began to fail, his vision deteriorating, his strength waning. In his weakness, Wu found opportunity. She stepped forward as his proxy, issuing edicts in his name, presiding over court meetings, even reviewing memorials intended solely for the emperor's eyes. Ministers knew the truth but dared not voice it. China was now ruled by a woman. At first, Wu governed cautiously. She favored Buddhism over the traditional Confucian order, using its doctrines to legitimize her presence in politics. After all, if the Buddha had once appeared as a woman, why couldn't a woman guide the empire? It was spiritual logic with political force. She restructured the bureaucracy, promoting officials based on merit rather than family name. This was revolutionary in a court dominated by aristocratic bloodlines. To her supporters, she was a reformer. To her enemies, she was a social incendiary, setting fire to centuries of tradition. Still, Wu played the long game. She never rushed the throne. Instead, she waited, systematically removing rivals, cultivating allies, and mastering the language of statecraft. She planted informants like seeds throughout the bureaucracy. She used the imperial secret police like pruning shears. Any official who opposed her found themselves demoted, exiled, or executed, all while she maintained an outwardly dutiful demeanor toward the emperor. In 683, Gaozong died. The natural order should have restored male rule. Their son Zhongzong ascended the throne. But when he displayed signs of independence, daring to appoint his in-laws to important positions, Wu struck. She demoted him and installed another son, Ruizong, one more easily controlled. Behind the throne, she ruled absolutely as Empress Dowager and Regent. It was the perfect disguise for authority, a mother safeguarding the empire in her son's name. But soon, even the pretense of male rule began to chafe. Why hide anymore? The ministers grumbled. The court scribes whispered, China has never had a female emperor. They warned it would be unnatural. Wu listened. Then she quietly began to prepare. A new name, a new dynasty, and a new chapter in history, where the emperor wore a crown of phoenixes, not dragons. She wasn't content to rule from the shadows. She was ready to claim the light. In 690 CE, Wu Zetian finally cast aside all pretense. No more proxies. No more sons nominally occupying the throne with her influence guiding them. She declared the end of the Tang dynasty and announced the birth of a new regime. The Zhou dynasty, named after a golden age of ancient Chinese history, carefully chosen to evoke legitimacy and virtue. She was no longer Empress Dowager Wu. She was Huangdi Wu Zetian, China's first and only female emperor. The court was stunned. Some scholars recoiled in outrage, citing Confucian texts that depicted women as obedient, modest, and confined to the inner chambers. But Wu had already rewritten the rules. She surrounded herself with loyal officials, promoted commoners who owed their rise to her, and crushed dissent before it could take root. To reinforce her mandate, she heavily emphasized Buddhism. Temples were constructed across the empire, proclaiming her as the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. One monk even discovered a scripture declaring that a woman would one day rule the world and bring universal peace. Conveniently, that woman was seated on the throne. She commissioned portraits of herself seated on the throne with calm authority, and inscriptions carved in stone that praised her as a divine monarch. In a patriarchal society, it was nothing short of heresy. And yet, it succeeded. Wu governed with a blend of steel and silk. She strengthened the civil service exam system, ensuring that bureaucrats were chosen by ability, not birthright. She implemented agricultural reforms, reduced burdens on farmers, and increased state revenue. Under her reign, the empire remained largely stable and prosperous. But her power came with a price. She relied on a secret police network that detected dissent like incense smoke in a temple. Court intrigues intensified. Critics disappeared. Rumors of executions, forced suicides, and torture chambers circulated like dark incense behind palace walls. Even so, she ruled with an iron grace. She wore the dragon robe. She granted imperial audiences. She issued decrees under her own name. For 15 years, Wu wasn't just the most powerful woman in China. She was the most powerful person. She had ascended every rung of a ladder she was never meant to touch, and now she stood alone at the summit, ruling China as its only female emperor. Ruling China as its sole female emperor brought immense prestige, but it also made Wu the target of every grievance, fear, and bruised ego in the empire. She had defied tradition, challenged Confucian order, and outmaneuvered generations of noblemen. And that meant one thing: everyone in silk was watching her and waiting. The court simmered with quiet rebellion. Ministers who bowed during the day conspired by candlelight at night. Even among her own children, there was no safety. The sons she had once used as pawns began to resent her absolute control. They desired power, but Wu had taught them too well how perilous ambition could be. She trusted none of them. To survive, Wu didn't just govern. She engaged in a relentless game of psychological chess. Suspected conspirators were removed under vague charges. Trials were swift, confessions often coerced, and executions public. Her enemies portrayed her as bloodthirsty, but in reality, she was precise. This wasn't madness. It was method. She created new ranks within the bureaucracy, titles that seemed grand but held little actual power. It was her way of rewarding loyalty without relinquishing real control. She also elevated the status of women at court, placing female relatives and trusted concubines into positions that would have been unimaginable a generation prior. Yet, as the years progressed, her reliance on a few key figures began to cast shadows on her legacy. Two favorites in particular, the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yi and Zhang Chongzong, rose from court entertainers to political insiders. Handsome, charming, and decades younger, they quickly gained favor, and with it, influence. To her critics, this was scandalous. The emperor, once known for her keen intellect and ruthless command, was now seen as a lonely woman clinging to youth through the company of fawning courtiers. Whispers of corruption and decadence began to spread, but those whispers couldn't erase her accomplishments. Under her rule, literacy expanded, civil service exams were reformed, and state infrastructure improved. She hadn't merely ruled, she had governed effectively. Still, her health began to decline. Her grip on power, though still firm, was weakening. And behind her, vultures circled, eager for a return to normalcy, to a throne once again ruled by a man. Wu knew the end was approaching. The only question now was, would it come by illness or betrayal? By the early 700s, Wu Zetian was in her 70s, an advanced age for anyone, let alone an emperor. Her body grew frail, her strength waned, and yet her mind remained sharp, ever vigilant to the shifting currents of court politics. She still ruled, but now from a reclining couch behind golden screens, hidden from view. and those closest to her began circling like wolves, sensing weakness. Her reliance on the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yi and Zhang Changzong, became a source of ridicule and resentment. Once charming favorites, they were now viewed as corrupt sycophants who manipulated imperial decisions for their own gain. Ministers who had long tolerated their presence began to plot. In 705 CE, the palace finally reached its breaking point. A group of senior officials and generals launched a swift coup. It wasn't bloody. It didn't need to be. The empress was surrounded, her allies captured, and the Zhang brothers were summarily executed, their heads displayed to the court as a signal. The phoenix's wings had been clipped. Faced with overwhelming pressure and deteriorating health, Wu Zetian had no choice but to abdicate. She was compelled to step down and restore her son Zhongzong to the throne, the same son she had previously removed for daring to think independently. She retreated into retirement, her once vast court reduced to a small entourage. And yet, even in abdication, she retained her title as emperor and continued to exert some influence behind closed doors. China may have changed the name on its throne, but the echo of Wu Zetian's reign still lingered in every policy, every law, every shaken official fearful of another woman with ideas. She died later that same year. No grand tomb inscription, no flowery epitaph. Her name was quietly removed from official histories. The Tang Dynasty erased her as thoroughly as they could, as if her reign had been a bad dream they preferred not to discuss. But history, like Wu herself, is difficult to silence. For decades afterward, poets and scholars debated her. Was she a usurper or a visionary? A tyrant or a savior of the state? A murderer or a reformer? What is certain is this: she broke every rule the empire tried to write for her. And for 15 years, she didn't just defy history, she became it. After her death in 705 CE, the Tang dynasty swiftly moved to erase Wu Zetian's unprecedented reign. Official histories were rewritten. Her reforms were attributed to her male successors. Her name, carved into records and temples, was scratched out, replaced with safer, more familiar male names. Yet despite the state's efforts, Wu Zetian refused to vanish. The people remembered her. Scholars couldn't ignore her. Foreign emissaries continued to speak of the female emperor who once ruled the greatest empire on earth. And in a strange twist of fate, it was the very scholars and historians tasked with minimizing her legacy who ensured its survival. You can erase a name, but not a reign that shaped a generation. Her accomplishments were undeniable. She had elevated Buddhism to new prominence, making it a central pillar of imperial legitimacy. She had restructured the civil service, making exams more meritocratic and reducing aristocratic nepotism. She had defended the empire's borders, launched successful military campaigns, and largely kept internal rebellion in check, an achievement most male rulers could only hope for. And for women, Wu Zetian's reign was a brief, radiant constellation in a dark sky of subjugation. She appointed women to key positions, funded female education, and offered unprecedented access to the levers of power. Her rule became a mythic precedent, proof that a woman could not only survive the palace but dominate it. Still, her legacy is complex. Later Confucian historians portrayed her as a monster adorned with makeup, a femme fatale who seduced her way to power and bathed her court in blood. Stories of her cruelty were exaggerated. Her lovers multiplied, her ruthlessness elevated to near-demonic proportions. It was easier to villainize her than to admit she had outperformed many of her male predecessors. But modern historians have begun to balance the scales. Today, Wu Zetian is recognized not just as a powerful woman, but as one of the most effective rulers in Chinese history, male or female. Her reign, complex and contradictory, remains a masterclass in statecraft, political survival, and ideological manipulation. She ruled in a time that dictated she should be silent. She conquered a system designed to crush her. And in the ashes of her attempted erasure, her name still burns. Quiet, powerful, and unforgettable. To comprehend Wu Zetian's reign is to understand the China she shaped, not merely through edicts and executions, but through culture, ideology, and identity. Her rule wasn't just a political anomaly, it was a civilizational turning point. For one, she redefined the meaning of being imperial. Traditional emperors surrounded themselves with Confucian scholars and war generals. Wu Zetian, in contrast, built her court around Buddhist monks, scholars from humble backgrounds, and fiercely loyal officials who owed their careers to her vision of meritocracy. This fundamentally altered the power structure of the Tang dynasty. Under Wu Zetian, the civil service exams became more inclusive and rigorous. This empowered scholars from poorer, non-noble families, a dramatic departure from the aristocratic monopolies that had dominated since the Han Dynasty. In doing so, she laid the groundwork for a more dynamic, educated bureaucracy that would endure long after her death. Culturally, she ignited a golden age of Buddhist art and architecture. Temples, pagodas, and colossal statues were erected in her name and image. At Longmen Grottoes, a massive statue of Vairocana Buddha bears unmistakable features resembling Wu herself: regal, calm, and all-seeing. These were not merely religious offerings. They were political monuments, each structure whispering the same radical message. A woman could embody cosmic order. She also altered the language of rulership. Wu Zetian introduced dozens of new Chinese characters into official use, some to express abstract virtues, others designed specifically to glorify her rule. Most of these characters vanished after her reign, but the audacity of crafting a new script to describe a new regime speaks volumes about her vision. Perhaps most revolutionary was her manipulation of gender roles. By portraying herself as both mother and sovereign, she fused the intimate and the imperial. She didn't challenge masculinity directly. She absorbed it into her persona. She was at once the nurturing protector and the ruthless enforcer, the dragon and the phoenix, the emperor and the empress. Her empire was not perfect. Dissent was punished harshly, and trust was a rare commodity. But it functioned, evolved, and expanded under her, and that, despite centuries of resistance to her legacy, cannot be denied. Wu Zetian didn't just rule the Tang dynasty, she reshaped it. Wu Zetian died over 1,300 years ago, and yet the echo of her reign still ripples through China's cultural memory, a haunting melody of brilliance, brutality, and bold defiance. While her name was once scraped from stone and banished from official annals, time possesses a way of unearthing what history attempts to bury. In the centuries that followed, she became a paradox in popular folklore. She was portrayed as everything from a cruel seductress to a divine ruler. Opera troupes dramatized her life, sometimes depicting her as a tragic heroine, sometimes as a ruthless tyrant. She was demonized, sanctified, misunderstood, and yet never forgotten. No woman in Chinese history has ever matched her ascent or her crown. Others held power as dowagers or regents, but none ever declared themselves emperor. None dared to remake dynasties, rewrite language, or stand alone atop the world's most powerful throne. And the legacy of that fact, that she broke the unbreakable rule, continues to inspire debate. To some, she remains a cautionary tale, the danger of unbound ambition, of femininity in armor. But to others, especially modern historians, feminists, and political thinkers, she is something else entirely. A symbol of resilience, a case study in raw political genius, a monument to the cost and consequence of leading when you were never intended to. Even today, Wu Zetian is more than a historical figure. She's a mirror. In her rise, you observe the gears of systemic injustice turning, and in her reign, the moment they were jammed. She didn't just defy expectations, she obliterated them, and yet she also paid the price of greatness. Her legacy remains clouded by moral ambiguity. She utilized fear as much as fairness. Her enemies died not just in disgrace, but sometimes without trial, their voices lost to history. Her compassion was selective, her justice strategic. She was not a saint, but she was never attempting to be one. Wu Zetian ruled not to be liked, but to survive. And in surviving, she made history. And so she remains, the woman emperor who rose from the shadows of concubinage, who walked into a world that said no, and answered with a throne. In a land of dragons, She crowned herself the phoenix, and in that flame, she etched her name into eternity. In the ancient world, a road wasn't merely a convenience. It was a declaration of power. The moment a ruler commanded a road to be carved through forest, desert, or mountain, it wasn't about ease of travel. It was about control. Roads embodied an empire in motion. Unlike rivers or oceans, which nature dictated, roads were human impositions. They sliced through geography, tethered distant outposts to capitals, and reminded everyone, from merchant to rebel, that civilization possessed far reach. A well-built road meant troops could move swiftly, taxes could be collected efficiently, and goods from the frontier could be transported to the empire's heart. The earliest known roads date back to Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE. These weren't paved highways, but compacted dirt paths used for carts and trade caravans. Even then, societies recognized a crucial truth. When people move, ideas, goods, and influence move with them. And whoever constructs the path controls the flow. In ancient Persia, the royal road stretched over 1,600 miles from Sardis to Susa. It featured way stations, rest areas, and royal couriers who could gallop across the empire in record time. Herodotus claimed a message could traverse its entire length in just 7 days, unheard of for the era. That speed wasn't just impressive, it was intimidating. It meant that the king's voice could reach every corner of the empire in days, not weeks. But it was the Romans who perfected the road as an imperial instrument. They constructed over 50,000 miles of stone-paved roads across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, straight, durable, and astonishingly well-engineered. These roads were designed not for aesthetic appeal, but for efficiency. Marching legions, grain shipments, imperial messengers, each depended on that solid stone beneath their feet. Roman roads often originated with military objectives, but their civilian impact was equally transformative. Farmers could transport their goods to markets, travelers could cross regions safely, and cities became connected not just by politics but by stone and effort. In every significant civilization, the road was never just about transportation. It was about transformation, because to build a road was to reshape the land, and with it, reshape the power that governed it. If the ancient world possessed an engineering superpower, it was Rome, and their greatest tool wasn't merely the aqueduct or the arch. It was the road. Roman roads weren't just pathways. They were the very skeleton of an empire. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't metaphorical. It was a logistical reality. The Romans constructed over 50,000 miles of roads, stone-laid, expertly drained, and remarkably straight. They connected Britain to Egypt, the Rhine to the Danube, and every strategic military outpost in between. These roads made the empire feel smaller, faster, and more manageable. Roman engineers followed a precise formula. First, they selected a route, not necessarily the easiest, but often the most direct. Then came surveying, utilizing tools like the groma for right angles and distance. Once the path was established, excavation began. A Roman road was built in layers, like a cake of conquest. The bottom layer, statumen, consisted of large stones. Above that came rudis, a mixture of crushed stone and lime. Next was nucleus, a layer of compacted sand or gravel. Finally, the summa crusta, a paved top of interlocking stone slabs, often crowned in the center for water runoff. The result was a road that could withstand centuries of weather, hooves, and sandals. Some remain in use today, but engineering was only half the story. Roman roads came with integrated infrastructure, mile markers, rest stops, and way stations called mansions where officials and messengers could rest and resupply. The cursus publicus, Rome's courier system, utilized these roads to transmit messages across the empire with astonishing speed, nearly 50 miles a day in some cases. And the roads transported more than mail. They transported legions. A rebellion in Gaul, a skirmish in Judea. Roman troops could march hundreds of miles faster than any enemy anticipated. Roads became an extension of Rome's military might, silent, solid, and perpetually advancing. But with soldiers came settlers, and with settlers came cities. Roads encouraged trade, migration, and the dissemination of Roman law, language, and architecture. They were arteries, circulating culture as well as conquest. For Rome, a road wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity, a symbol, a message etched in stone that declared, "Rome is here." And wherever Rome built, the world beneath their feet was transformed. While Rome constructed roads with stone, the Inca Empire built them reaching for the sky. Spanning over 25,000 miles, the Capac-Nan, the Great Inca Road System, was a marvel of Andean engineering. It interconnected one of Earth's most challenging landscapes, linking deserts, jungles, and mountains that ascended past 13,000 feet. And the Inca achieved all of this without the wheel, without draft animals beyond the llama, and without metal tools in the European sense. This wasn't just a road system, it was the very backbone of an empire. At its heart was Cusco, the Inca capital. Radiating outward like spokes on a sunwheel, the roads connected provincial centers, military outposts, agricultural hubs, and sacred sites. The most renowned stretch is the Inca Trail, which winds its way to Machu Picchu, but that was merely one thread in a vast imperial network. The roads varied in size and construction. In the lowlands, they were broad and paved with stone. In the high mountains, they were narrow paths carved into cliffs, sometimes no wider than a foot. Where rivers flowed, the Inca constructed rope suspension bridges, fashioned from woven grasses strong enough to support travelers and llama caravans. These bridges required yearly reconstruction, a communal ritual that persists in parts of Peru today. There were no wheeled carts. All transportation relied on foot or llamas. But the Incas possessed something even more efficient: chasca relay runners. These messengers sprinted between tambos or rest stations, built every few miles. Messages, food, and even fresh fish from the coast could reach the emperor in Cusco within days. This system allowed the empire to function with astonishing speed despite the absence of a written script. But the roads were also spiritual. Many followed CQE lines, sacred alignments that radiated from Cusco to shrines and mountains. Travel wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Each step reinforced imperial order and religious harmony. The Capac-Nan wasn't a Roman-style conquest machine. It was a binding thread, a means to hold a vertical empire together. From snow-capped peaks to coastal deserts, the roads facilitated unity. And though much of it is gone today, some stretches still endure. Stones fitted without mortar still bearing footsteps after 500 years. The Inca didn't merely conquer the Andes. They stitched it together one path at a time. Centuries before Rome, and far removed from the Andean peaks, another empire interconnected its vast territory with stone and strategy: the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And at its core ran the Royal Road, a 1,500-mile engineering triumph stretching from Sardis in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, to Susa, one of the Persian capitals. Commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE, the Royal Road wasn't merely a route for moving goods. It was a political artery, a demonstration of imperial sophistication, and one of the earliest true long-distance highways in recorded history. The Persians didn't invent roads, but they standardized them, militarized them, and made them the bedrock of bureaucracy. Their engineers scouted routes that balanced terrain challenges with directness, avoiding swamps and traversing mountains when necessary. The outcome was a surprisingly smooth and swift connection across a continent-spanning empire. Herodotus documented that royal messengers could traverse the entire Royal Road in 7 days, a journey that would have taken an ordinary traveler approximately 90 days. How? Through a system of relay stations. Every 15 to 18 miles, there were posting stations with fresh horses and supplies. Couriers would switch horses and continue riding at top speed, a system that predated the Pony Express by over 2,000 years. But these roads weren't exclusively for messengers. Merchants, military units, diplomats, and tax collectors utilized them constantly. The Royal Road helped unify a multi-ethnic empire that encompassed Greeks, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and more. It enabled something extraordinary in the ancient world: centralized oversight of distant provinces. Road guards ensured safety, and caravanserais provided shelter and provisions. The entire system relied on meticulous maintenance and order, two aspects at which the Persian bureaucracy excelled. Road crews were deployed to repair damage, and tolls were sometimes collected at river crossings or mountain passes. The Persians also pioneered road markers and milestones, tools for measuring distance and ensuring consistency across regions. These practices would later influence Rome and Byzantium. The royal road did not survive the fall of Persia intact, but its influence persisted. Alexander the Great used it to invade the empire, and the Romans later expanded upon the concept. Even today, modern highways follow parts of its ancient route. It demonstrated one powerful idea: an empire isn't ruled by the sword alone. It's ruled by the speed of a message and the strength of the road it travels. While the Romans were laying stone in Europe and the Incas were carving trails through the Andes, another empire was quietly constructing a road network that would shape the world in a different way: Han Dynasty China. Their roads didn't just connect cities. They stitched together a civilization and fueled the rise of one of the most legendary trade systems in human history: the Silk Road. Under the Han Dynasty, especially during the reign of Emperor Wu, 141 to 87 BCE, roads became an instrument for expansion and control. The government poured resources into constructing and maintaining long-distance routes that extended from the imperial capital of Chang'an into Central Asia. These roads weren't solely for merchants. They were vital military and administrative arteries. Unlike Roman roads, Han roads weren't uniformly stone-paved. Many were hard-packed dirt or gravel, occasionally reinforced with planks in muddy regions or stone slabs in high-traffic areas. But what they lacked in uniform engineering, they compensated for in scale and organization. The postal relay system, known as the Ichan, was remarkably advanced. Stations were positioned at regular intervals, complete with fresh horses and accommodations for government messengers. This allowed imperial decrees and tax records to travel across thousands of miles with surprising speed. These roads supported not just governance, but diplomacy and trade. Envoys like Zhang Qian, who journeyed westward into Central Asia, opened up contact with cultures as far as Persia and India. Silk, jade, paper, and spices flowed outward. In return, China received horses, glassware, and new agricultural concepts. Security was paramount. The Han invested heavily in maintaining military garrisons along the routes, especially near the Hushi Corridor, a narrow, windswept strip of land that served as a gateway between China and the West. Watchtowers, beacon mounds, and walled settlements dotted the road, creating a network of imperial presence. Culturally, the road system enabled the spread of Confucianism, Buddhism, and administrative practices across diverse regions. Travelers, monks, soldiers, and merchants moved ideas along with goods, shaping a unified identity that would endure long beyond the Han. Han roads weren't built to impress. They were built to last. And while many vanished beneath later cities or were reclaimed by dust and desert, their legacy persisted, because through these roads, China didn't just defend its borders. It opened a door to the world. The ancient Greeks are rarely celebrated for their roads. They didn't construct grand highways like the Romans or vast networks like the Persians. But what they did build, though more modest in scale, reveals how roads could shape not only commerce and warfare, but culture, religion, and identity. Greece's rugged, mountainous terrain made road building challenging and expensive. So instead of imperial highways, the Greeks developed a patchwork of stone-paved local routes, often connecting city-states rather than unifying a vast empire. These roads followed natural terrain and were typically narrow, just wide enough for pack animals or chariots. Yet despite their simplicity, they played a crucial role in the Greek world. One of the most famous routes was the sacred way from Athens to Eleusis, used during the Eleusinian Mysteries, religious festivals dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. Each year, thousands of initiates walked this road in a grand procession, chanting hymns and carrying offerings. For them, the road was not merely a path, it was a rite of passage, a journey from the world of the living into mystery and transformation. Another iconic route was the Panhellenic Road leading to Delphi, the home of the Oracle of Apollo. Pilgrims, kings, and philosophers alike traveled this winding road through mountains and valleys to consult the oracle. Along the way were treasuries, shrines, and inscribed stones, forming a spiritual journey as much as a physical one. But Greek roads weren't exclusively sacred. They were utilized by soldiers, philosophers, and traders. Consider Xenophon's Anabasis, detailing the long retreat of Greek mercenaries through Persia, a brutal, road-bound odyssey. Or imagine Socrates, who frequently walked from the agora to the academy or the lyceum to teach under the open sky, his feet tracing worn paths of dialogue and debate. What distinguished Greek roads wasn't their engineering prowess. It was their integration into daily life. They weren't built by emperors to display dominance. They emerged organically, shaped by marketplaces, sanctuaries, and social rituals. And through them, ideas traveled just as quickly as soldiers or carts. Philosophy, theater, democracy, even Olympic athletes. They all moved on dusty, narrow roads that wound through olive groves and city gates. Simple as they were, Greek roads bore the weight of a civilization that transformed the world not by force, but by thought. In ancient India, roads weren't just channels of commerce. They were arteries of spiritual life, imperial governance, and cultural exchange. From the Mauryan Empire in the 3rd century BCE to later Gupta rule, Indian civilizations developed a remarkably organized road network that connected fertile river valleys, coastal ports, trade towns, and holy cities. The most transformative period for ancient Indian roads occurred under Emperor Ashoka, the Buddhist monarch who governed most of the subcontinent around 268 to 232 BCE. After renouncing violence following the bloody Kalinga War, Ashoka turned his focus to public welfare, and roads became a central feature of that transformation. Ashoka ordered the construction and expansion of roads across his empire. These weren't merely dirt paths. They were deliberately engineered routes, often lined with trees for shade, wells for water, and rest houses for travelers. He placed inscribed stone pillars along the roads, not to mark distances, but to proclaim edicts urging compassion, truthfulness, and religious tolerance. It was governance through visibility. The most famous of these roads extended from Pataliputra, modern-day Patna, to the northwest frontier, connecting the Ganges Plain to present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. This stretch later became part of the northern trade route that would evolve into the Silk Road, linking India to China, Persia, and the Greco-Roman world. Indian roads carried more than just goods. They carried faiths and philosophies. Buddhist monks traversed these roads to spread their teachings. Hindu pilgrims used them to journey between sacred rivers and temples. Even Jain sages took to these routes in quiet contemplation. The roads became bridges between ideas. Trade flourished. From the eastern coast, goods like spices, textiles, ivory, and gems traveled inland and outward, reaching Roman ports and Central Asian markets. Roads connected urban centers like Taxila, Ujjain, and Varanasi, each a hub of commerce and scholarship. Though many Indian roads were not paved like Roman ones, they were maintained seasonally, especially before monsoon rains. Engineers used gravel, wood planks, and packed earth, often elevated slightly to prevent flooding. What made India's ancient road system unique wasn't brute force. It was plurality. Roads served kings, farmers, saints, and scholars alike. They didn't just connect empires, they connected worldviews. And in that blend of purpose, part political, part spiritual, part economic, India paved not just roads, but pathways to influence that would stretch far beyond its borders. Ancient roads weren't just flat paths stretching across the land. They were feats of engineering that overcame rivers, ravines, and rugged terrain. To build effective roads, civilizations had to master the art of bridge building, drainage, and durable construction. The Romans were pioneers in bridge engineering. Their roads often crossed vast rivers using stone arch bridges, structures that could support heavy loads and endure centuries. The Ponte Fabricio in Rome and the Alcantara Bridge in Spain are prime examples. The Roman arch, utilizing keystones and carefully cut stones, distributed weight perfectly. Their bridges weren't merely practical. They were symbols of imperial power, inspiring awe and respect. But the Romans weren't alone. The Inca, confronted with wild rivers cutting through Andean gorges, constructed rope suspension bridges crafted from woven grasses and vines. These bridges were lightweight but incredibly strong, rebuilt annually by local communities in rituals still practiced today. Crossing these bridges was not just a physical challenge but a cultural one, binding communities to the land and to each other. In ancient China, engineers developed beam bridges and pontoon bridges. The famous Zhaozhou Bridge, built during the Sui Dynasty and completed in 605 CE, is the world's oldest open-spandrel stone segmental arch bridge. It combined aesthetic grace with remarkable engineering, allowing heavy traffic to cross the Jiaohe River for centuries. Drainage was equally critical. Roman roads were crowned in the center to shed rainwater quickly, with ditches on either side. In the wet and monsoon-prone lands of India and Southeast Asia, roads were often elevated on causeways or filled with gravel layers to prevent washouts. Some empires even built roads with multiple layers of materials, compacted soil, stones, gravel, and paving slabs to ensure durability. Beyond bridges and drainage, the creation of way stations and mile markers along ancient roads provided travelers with rest, supplies, and orientation, early versions of highway rest stops. These engineering achievements didn't just facilitate movement. They shaped economies, warfare, and culture. A bridge could determine whether an army could cross into enemy lands or be completely halted. A well-maintained road could mean the survival of a city through trade and communication. Ultimately, the engineering behind ancient roads was an expression of human ingenuity, a testament to how societies adapted to and reshaped their environments to move people, goods, and ideas across vast landscapes. Throughout history, ancient roads were more than mere pathways. They were the lifelines that enabled empires to flourish, expand, and endure. Roads connected distant cities and remote villages, facilitating trade, communication, and cultural exchange that defined civilizations. Empires understood that without efficient roads, armies could not move swiftly, governors could not enforce laws, and merchants could not prosper. Roads shaped economic hubs, encouraged urban growth, and even influenced the spread of religions and philosophies. The Silk Road, the Roman Via Appia, the Inca Capac Nan, all transported more than just goods. They transported ideas and identities. The maintenance of these roads required vast bureaucracies and dedicated labor forces, reflecting the organizational prowess of empires like Rome, Persia, China, and the Incas. Roads became a measure of an empire's reach and stability. When roads were kept in good repair, empires thrived. When neglected, regions drifted into isolation, rebellion, or decline. But roads also symbolize human ambition, the desire to connect, control, and communicate across vast spaces. They demonstrate how early engineers and leaders understood geography not just as a barrier, but as a canvas to reshape. Today, many ancient roads lie beneath modern highways, while others remain as archaeological treasures. They remind us that the infrastructure we often take for granted was once a monumental achievement, paved with sweat, stone, wood, and ingenuity. The legacy of ancient roads is alive in every journey we take, every letter sent, and every trade route that links our globalized world. They are the silent architects of empire, culture, and civilization. In essence, the story of ancient roads is the story of humanity itself. Ever on the move, building bridges, both literal and metaphorical, across time and space.